She wasn't just the first woman, she was the first rebel, and maybe the first victim of history's greatest cover-up. This is the truth about Eve the Church never wanted you to hear. For 2,000 years, Christianity has told the same story. Eve, the naive woman who doomed humanity with a single bite. The temptress who brought death into paradise. But what if everything taught in Sunday schools across the world is built on a lie? There are older stories, buried stories, that reveal Eve not as humanity's downfall, but as its awakening. Tonight, we're diving into texts the Church tried to erase, ancient Jewish writings that predate Christianity by centuries, hidden Gnostic gospels discovered in Egyptian caves, sources that reveal a shocking truth. The Eve from Sunday school isn't the only Eve. Furthermore, the real question isn't whether she was good or evil. The question is whether she was too dangerous to survive. Welcome to ancient Underworld, where gods fall, monsters rise, and devils whisper through the shadows of forgotten myths. If you enjoy exploring the dark side of mythology, like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another forgotten tale. Let's start with the story everyone knows, Genesis chapters 2 and 3. God creates Adam from the dust of the earth, places him in Eden, then decides man shouldn't be alone. From Adam's side comes a woman, Eve, perfect, innocent, walking naked without shame in paradise. Then comes the serpent, the tree, the conversation that would damn humanity forever. Has God really said you shall not eat from every tree? Eve listens. Eve sees the fruit is pleasing. Eve takes and eats. Eve gives to Adam. When God comes calling, it's Eve who makes excuses first. However, here's what's chilling about this story. It's not just what happened that matters, it's how the Church chose to tell it. For centuries, Eve became Christianity's perfect scapegoat. St. Augustine blamed her for original sin. Thomas Aquinas called her defective and misbegotten. Medieval preachers declared women the gateway to hell because of what Eve did. Consider the power of that narrative. One woman's choice becomes the justification for silencing half of humanity for millennia. One bite becomes the reason women can't teach, can't lead, can't be trusted with spiritual authority. But here's the twist. What if the Church Fathers had other options? They deliberately chose the version that served their purposes best. Here's where it gets dangerous for the official story. Ancient Jewish texts, written by rabbis who studied Genesis long before Christianity existed, tell a completely different tale. In the Midrash, Eve isn't Adam's inferior. She's his intellectual equal, his spiritual partner, someone who understands the weight of choice and knowledge. Some rabbinical writings suggest something that would terrify church leaders. Eve wasn't deceived at all. She knew exactly what she was choosing. Knowledge over innocence, growth over stagnation, the courage to become more than what they were, even if it meant losing paradise. In these traditions, Eve's decision wasn't a fall. It was evolution, but the real bombshell comes from Gnostic texts, hidden for over 1,500 years. In the hypostasis of the Archons, discovered in 1945, Eve isn't the villain. She's the hero. She's spiritually superior to Adam. She receives divine knowledge directly from heavenly beings. She doesn't fall for a serpent's lie. She's instructed by divine feminine wisdom to wake Adam from his spiritual sleep. In these suppressed traditions, eating from the tree of knowledge wasn't humanity's damnation. It was humanity's graduation. Furthermore, Eve wasn't the weak link who destroyed paradise. She was the wise woman who chose consciousness over comfortable ignorance. Which raises a crucial question. Why did these stories disappear while the Church's version survived? If stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because the deeper we dig into forgotten texts, the more we discover that history's greatest villains might actually be its hidden heroes. Now we reach the heart of the conspiracy. As Christianity gained political power, certain interpretations of Eve's story didn't just become popular, they became law. Additionally, those interpretations happen to be exactly the ones that justified keeping women powerless, voiceless, and controlled. Early church fathers weaponized Eve's story with surgical precision. Tertullian called women the devil's gateway. John Chrysostom preached that women were spiritually defective because of Eve's sin. Century after century, theologians used her narrative to build walls around women's minds and spirits. Look at medieval art, read ancient sermons, visit old cathedrals. Everywhere you turn, the same image: Eve as seductress, Eve as tempter, Eve as the source of mankind's suffering. This wasn't accidental. Church leaders had access to those alternative interpretations we just explored. They knew about the Jewish commentaries that honored Eve. They'd read the Gnostic texts that made her a hero, yet they chose silence. They chose erasure. They chose the version that made women complicit in their own oppression. For over 1,000 years, Eve's story justified laws that treated women as property, theologies that excluded them from education, and cultures that saw them as spiritually dangerous. Make no mistake, this wasn't a theological accident. It was strategic theology. When you need to control half the population, you need an origin story that makes that control seem divinely ordained. When you need women to accept their subordination, you need a founding narrative that makes them seem spiritually unreliable. One question haunts this entire narrative. If Eve was really just a simple-minded woman who fell for a serpent's trick, why did her story need to be so carefully controlled? The official story survives on translation. Change a word, and you can change a world. In Genesis, the woman is called a helper fit for him, but the Hebrew phrase is ezer kenegdo, not a junior assistant, not a subordinate aide, but a strength facing him, a counterpart of equal force standing eye to eye. Elsewhere in Scripture, Ezer describes God as Israel's rescuer in battle. If the term carries divine strength when applied to God, why is it reduced to helper only when applied to Eve? Then there's the famous rib. The word is tsela, used dozens of times for the side of a building, the flank of the tabernacle, architectural halves that mirror and complete each other. Read that way, the woman is not a spare part removed from a man. She is the other side, the matched half, built, banar, the verb used for altars, and sanctuaries to form a living sanctuary of two. The story shifts from surgical extraction to sacred architecture. Not derivative, but deliberate. Consider the name. Chava, Eve, is tied to Chaya, life. Adam names her not as an act of domination, but recognition, mother of all living. In the ancient world, naming could assert power, but it could also announce revelation. This is what you are. The narrative's center of gravity tilts. Life does not continue through Adam, it flows through Eve. Even the serpent's role looks different in Hebrew. Nachash means serpent, yes, but its verbal root, nhh, can mean to divine, to read omens. Knowledge is in the etymology, and when the text says, "You will be like gods, knowing good and evil," the Hebrew yada, to know, is the verb of intimate comprehension, not mere data. The tree is not about trivia, it's about moral consciousness, the crossing of a threshold from innocence to discernment. And that line so often used to sanctify patriarchy. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Genesis 3:16. In Hebrew it reads as consequence, not command, prognosis, not prescription. It does not say he ought to rule, it says he will. The text mirrors what happens when fear and blame enter a relationship. Domination arises as a symptom of rupture, not the design of God. Patriarchy is described, not ordained. Thread these pieces together and the portrait sharpens. The woman as matched strength, the human pair as a constructed sanctuary. The fruit as moral awakening. The rule of man as a tragic fallout rather than divine decree. Strip away the mistranslations and the story no longer proves that Eve was born to submit. It suggests she was born to stand, as the other side of humanity's living temple, bearer of life, partner in discernment, and participant in a destiny that fear tried to rename. Before Eve became the church's scapegoat, wisdom wore a woman's face. In Israel's own scriptures, Hokmah speaks, "The Lord created me at the beginning of his work. I was beside him, like a master craftswoman." Proverbs 8. Creation unfolds with feminine wisdom, standing at the architect's table. Later, mystics would call that presence Shekinah, the indwelling glory. Older still, Israel's neighbors honored goddesses who guarded knowledge, fertility, and kingship. Asherah, Anat, Inanna. Archaeologists have even found inscriptions to Hwaych and his Asherah, relics of a time when the divine feminine had not yet been erased from public memory. Once you see that lineage, Eve looks less like an isolated figure and more like the last mask of a dethroned tradition. The serpent itself is older than the accusation pinned to it. In Israel's wilderness stood Nehushtan, the bronze serpent raised for healing. Across the Near East, serpents symbolized wisdom, renewal, the shedding of ignorance like an old skin. No wonder Gnostic texts reverse the charge. Sophia, divine wisdom, moves through the serpent to awaken, not to ruin. In the hypostasis of the archons, Eve becomes the one who recognizes the counterfeit law of lesser powers and reaches for the real. The Church could not tolerate that inheritance. A world in which wisdom is feminine and the serpent heals is a world where the woman at the tree is not simply a cautionary tale, but a candidate for prophecy. So the symbols were inverted. Wisdom became disobedience, the serpent became Satan, and Eve became the origin of blame. The feminine principle that once stood at creation's side was recast as creation's undoing. Look beyond the Levant and the pattern repeats. Hesiod's Pandora, crafted to explain why men suffer, is the Greek cousin of the medieval Eve, woman as the jar opener of woes. But there are older voices buried under that slander. Sumer's Inanna descending for knowledge, Isis reassembling divine truth, Sophia calling sleepers to wake. Strip away the political varnish, and the feminine is not the fool, it is the key. And that is exactly the point. Eve is not an anomaly, she is an axis. Change her, and the whole cosmology tilts. Restore her to wisdom-bearer, and the story of humanity shifts from suspicion to stewardship, from control to collaboration, from borrowed authority to shared insight, which is why her image had to be broken and reassembled into something safer. Not because truth demanded it, but because power did. When the Church reduced Eve to a temptress, they weren't just blaming one woman for humanity's downfall, they were declaring war on something far more ancient and threatening, the archetype of the divine feminine. Long before Genesis was written, civilizations across the ancient world revered the feminine as the source of wisdom, fertility, and balance. In Mesopotamia, the goddess Inanna risked everything to descend into the underworld in search of deeper truths, mirroring Eve's choice to reach for forbidden knowledge despite the cost. In Egypt, Isis pieced together the broken body of Osiris, restoring him with divine magic, an act of remembrance and power rooted in love. In Greece, Sophia, the embodiment of divine wisdom, stood as a figure who illuminated creation itself. These were not passive figures waiting to be led by men. They were initiators, guides, keepers of mysteries. Eve fits into this archetypal pattern seamlessly. The fruit she took was not mere food. It was the same descent, the same quest for wisdom, the same refusal to remain in a state of obedient ignorance. But the Church could not allow this connection to remain visible. To admit Eve was part of this lineage meant acknowledging that women too held direct access to divine wisdom. And if women could stand as spiritual equals, or even leaders, then the carefully constructed hierarchy of male authority in church and society would collapse. So the Church rewrote the narrative. Lilith, once revered as a goddess of independence in Mesopotamian traditions, was recast as a demon who preyed on children and men. Sophia, the Gnostic figure of divine wisdom, was cast into silence, stripped of her authority in official doctrine. Eve, whose choice mirrored the great feminine archetypes of wisdom-seeking across cultures, was remade into the origin of sin itself. This wasn't simply theology, it was strategy. By demonizing the feminine, the Church disempowered half of humanity while consolidating its own control. The divine feminine, once revered in every corner of the ancient world, was forced underground, hidden in symbols, whispered in esoteric circles, preserved in secret societies and mystical traditions. But the memory never died. The parallels are too striking, the archetypes too enduring. Eve was never just Adam's companion or the weak link in paradise. She was the vessel of the forbidden feminine, the archetypal wisdom seeker whose story connects to the oldest truths humanity ever told. Erasing that legacy didn't destroy it. It only ensured it would rise again, more dangerous for having been buried. If this reframes everything you thought you knew, you're in the right place. We dig where institutions refuse. Hit subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next layer we unearth. Because once you start seeing the pattern, you'll spot it everywhere. The rewriting of Eve's story was not confined to ancient manuscripts. Its consequences bled into every law, every sermon, every cultural assumption about women for centuries to come. The Eve as temptress narrative was not just theology, it became the foundation of social control. During the Middle Ages, when women dared to claim knowledge, they were branded as dangerous. Herbalists, midwives, healers, women who carried fragments of ancient wisdom about the body and the natural world, were accused of witchcraft. Thousands were hunted, tortured, and executed, not because they practiced dark sorcery, but because they represented the living memory of Eve's rebellion. The witch hunts were not random superstition. They were the continuation of the war against Eve. Every trial, every fire was a warning. Women who reached for forbidden knowledge would pay the price. And yet Eve's shadow could not be erased. Her story persisted in secret traditions. Jewish mystics preserved hints of her higher role in Kabbalistic writings. Gnostic communities remembered her as Sophia's reflection, the one who woke humanity from spiritual sleep. Renaissance thinkers, studying suppressed manuscripts, whispered that humanity's greatness lay not in blind obedience, but in the courage to choose knowledge, echoing Eve's act in Eden. Even in modern times, Eve's legacy lingers. Every struggle for women's education, for equality, for authority in spiritual and cultural life, is a reclamation of what was stolen in Eden. The fruit she reached for still symbolizes the forbidden: knowledge, agency, freedom. But it also represents the power institutions most fear: individuals thinking for themselves, seeking wisdom without permission. And this is where the Church's greatest fear becomes clear. If Eve was not the origin of sin, but the origin of consciousness, then the entire theological framework of guilt, redemption, and obedience begins to unravel. If the first woman's act was not disobedience but evolution, then salvation itself becomes unnecessary. Humanity would not need priests to mediate divine access, nor dogma to dictate morality. Eve's choice would stand as proof that humans could awaken on their own. This is the legacy the Church tried to bury, not just a woman who ate a piece of fruit, but a symbol of humanity's right to seek knowledge, to challenge boundaries, to embrace the power within. Eve is not merely a figure of the past, she is the ever-present question. Will we obey in ignorance or dare to awaken? For 2,000 years, theologians insisted Eve's act was a mistake. But when we strip away the layers of doctrine and return to the oldest sources, a terrifying possibility emerges. What if her act wasn't a fall at all, but an initiation? The Gnostics whispered that the serpent wasn't a tempter, but a liberator. In their texts, the serpent is the voice of Sophia, divine wisdom, guiding Eve to wake humanity from the dream imposed by the archons, those rulers of a false paradise. Eden wasn't a gift, it was a prison. The walls of paradise weren't fences of safety, but chains of ignorance. And Eve, not Adam, saw it first. Think of what this means. If Eve was the first to take the fruit, she wasn't sinning. She was seeing. She was tearing down the illusion, ripping away the veil, breaking humanity free from divine containment. Her act wasn't disobedience, it was defiance. Not weakness, but courage. She chose knowledge, not comfort, consciousness, not ignorance, growth, not stagnation. Now ask yourself, why would the Church want to bury this? Because if Eve was right, then the foundations of Christian theology collapse. Original sin becomes original awakening. The fall becomes the first ascent. The need for salvation disappears, and with it, the entire power structure of the Church. If humanity was never condemned, then humanity never needed rescuing. If Eve's rebellion was wisdom, then obedience to divine command was blindness. That is the forbidden revelation, that Eve was never the ruin of mankind. She was its beginning. The first to recognize the prison, the first to step outside it, the first to awaken Adam to a higher truth. And here lies the deepest fear of the Church. If Eve was the first rebel, then every woman who refuses silence, every seeker who refuses ignorance, every thinker who refuses control is carrying her torch. Her defiance wasn't just a moment in Eden, it was the spark of a fire that can never be extinguished. This is the story they erased, not because it was untrue, but because it was too true. Because if humanity ever remembered that its first sin was really its first act of liberation, the chains would break, the cathedrals would empty, and the gatekeepers of salvation would lose their power forever. If Eve's act was the first awakening, then everything that followed, every sermon, every counsel, every law designed to silence women and punish seekers, was damage control, a desperate attempt to bury the truth before it spread. But truth has a way of rising, and Eve's choice set in motion a ripple effect that has haunted institutions for millennia. Look at history. Every great leap forward, every dangerous question, every forbidden discovery carries Eve's signature. Galileo peering through his telescope, defying the heavens as the Church defined them. Hypatia of Alexandria, teaching philosophy until the mob tore her apart. Women burned as witches, not for summoning demons, but for preserving fragments of healing knowledge. Each act is a reenactment of Eden, each punishment a desperate attempt to undo what can never be undone. And here's the ultimate consequence. Eve's story isn't finished. It was never just about one woman in a garden. It's about humanity itself, standing at the tree again and again, faced with the same choice: ignorance or knowledge, obedience or awakening, comfort or growth. Eden wasn't lost once. It is lost and remade every time we choose. But the Church knew this. That's why they had to rewrite her story. Because Eve is not just the past, she is the present and the future. She is every challenge to authority, every voice demanding truth, every woman who refuses silence, every man who dares to think beyond the boundaries drawn for him. Her legacy is alive in every act of rebellion that expands human consciousness. The cosmic consequence is this: the story of Eve was never about punishment, it was prophecy. Humanity was always meant to awaken, to step beyond the walls of paradise, to risk the fruit of knowledge and pay the price of freedom. The Church tried to turn prophecy into crime, but the prophecy continues to unfold. Eve's hand reaching for the fruit was not the end of paradise, it was the beginning of humanity. And every time someone refuses control, every time knowledge triumphs over dogma, every time truth rises from suppression, the echo of that act resounds through time. This is why Eve's story could never be erased, no matter how many sermons condemned her, no matter how many texts were burned, no matter how many women were silenced. Because she is not just the first woman, she is the archetype of awakening, the spark of rebellion, the mother of human consciousness itself. And if that's true, then the greatest cover-up in history wasn't about a woman who ruined us. It was about a woman who saved us. So here we stand, 2,000 years later, with multiple versions of the same woman. Eve the wisdom seeker from Jewish tradition, Eve the divine knowledge bearer from Gnostic texts, Eve the dangerous temptress from church doctrine. Which Eve is real? Maybe that's the wrong question. The real question is which Eve serves whose interests? When institutions need to control half the population, they need origin stories that make that control seem divinely ordained. When men need to justify their authority over women, they need a founding narrative that makes women seem spiritually unreliable. Perhaps the truth about Eve isn't hiding in any single ancient text. Perhaps it's hiding in plain sight, in the very fact that her story had to be rewritten at all. What was so threatening about a woman who sought knowledge? Something was dangerous about a woman who chose growth over safety. Something was terrifying about a woman who might have been wiser than the man standing beside her. The church didn't just erase alternative stories about Eve. They erased the possibility that women could be spiritual leaders, knowledge seekers, and divine rebels. As a result, for centuries, half of humanity was silenced based on a carefully curated version of one woman's story. Was Eve humanity's downfall, or was she humanity's first step toward consciousness? The answer depends on whether you're afraid of women who refuse to stay silent. Stories have been buried. Heroes have been rewritten as villains. Truths are waiting in the shadows of forgotten texts, ready to shatter everything we thought we knew. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications for more revelations that challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient myths and hidden histories.